Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. Like a lot of you, I've been keeping tabs on the Tulsa Race Massacre lawsuit as it winds its way through the crooked courts. As we all know, the only reason that this wasn't all resolved over 100 years ago is because the litigants are black, and for no other reason. There is nobody else who this would have happened to that they would not have already been compensated and the murderers locked up a long time ago. The law is on the side of the Tulsa Race Massacre survivors. The facts are on their side. But what is not on their side is this racist country led by its white supremacist government, which has always been against them because it's always been against black people. Anti-black violence is not a crime in this country and is never supposed to be allowed to be the basis for a criminal prosecution or civil penalty. These are the largely unwritten rules of anti-black racism. Now, this crime against humanity occurred over 100 years ago, but at least 3 of the survivors of the massacre are miraculously still alive today. Leslie Benningfield Randall, Viola Fletcher, and Hughes Van Ellis. They were children at the time that this massacre happened to them, but whatever divine force you want to credit clearly wanted them to be here, not merely so that they could confront the state that had carried out this massacre against them, their family, their friends, and their loved ones, but also so that they could make it clear that this crime that happened didn't just happen to them, it also happened to their descendants too. Because, as has always been the case in this country, the main thing that can make a black person the #1 target of white supremacists, be they in government or out of it, is if that black person is financially better off than the white person who's looking at them. And that's exactly what happened here. This was a government-sponsored, government-carried-out program of forced black destitution. Take black people's property from them, their homes, take their land, take their lives, and then you go ahead and have all of these white supremacists who will be living in these people's homes, living on their land and saying it's ours now. Government-sanctioned theft. And this was not some fluke. This was an agenda that was at work. And the entire government was carrying it out. And speaking of which, we see Sheila Jackson Lee finally crawled out of whatever hole she's been hiding in just in time so she can go ahead and jump in front of the cameras. Sheila Jackson Lee is the Benjamin Crump of politics, desperately trying to make herself relevant to the reparations discourse again. She lost a lot of credibility when the black media began taking a serious look at H.R. 40 and a close look at her too. So now she's trying to jump in front of the cameras whenever she sees people who are actually doing the work that she refused to do. And I guess that she's trying to convince people that she was part of this, somehow. Wasting time with bills to study the greatest crime in human history as if we need to prove what was done against us. The only legislation that would have been relevant would have been a law saying to cut the check. Let's just cut to the chase here. Now, the Tulsa Race Massacre lawsuit, it's a particularly problematic issue for these white supremacists, at least from a rhetorical standpoint, because it deprives them of all the little talking points that they keep trying to use when it comes to slavery. Well, they can't say that nobody alive today was alive when the Tulsa Race Massacre happened. They can't say that. Their typical go-to talking points won't work on this one. But that's okay. It doesn't mean that they're not going to try to use it anyway. So what's the excuse now? Well, the excuse is, okay, they're still alive, but that was a long time ago. You see, they ran out of BS, and they're just mindlessly repeating their usual other talking point because that's the only thing that they can reach for. And you have the lawyer for the Tulsa Chamber of Commerce, and this scumbag says, well, what happened in 1921 was a really bad deal. And those people did not get a fair shake. That's how he describes hundreds of people being murdered. That's how he describes a race massacre. It was a really bad deal. They didn't get a fair shake. See, these white supremacists, they are completely and thoroughly casual about their anti-black racism, and they want you to know, as far as they're concerned, why is anyone even talking about this? The mendacity is the entire point. We're dealing with pure evil here. And there's no rules when it comes to dealing with evil. But of course, the Chamber of Commerce for that cesspool, of course they're going to be claiming that there's no liability here because they were the ones who benefited from this. You'll find that that Chamber of Commerce got its money and a number of individuals who suddenly found themselves with land and houses and such after they had driven the black people out. So yeah, all of the scumbags who benefited from this, now they're trying to pretend as if, okay, we can't deny that it happened, and we can't deny that there are people here in front of us who it happened to, so instead we're just going to say, oh, there's a statute of limitations on murder, Actually, there's not. So this case just exposes that, as we've said, it was never about how long ago slavery happened. It's always about the same thing that it's always been about, the black people who are making the demand. And they have been pressing this lawsuit for a century now. The Tulsa Race Massacres have been filing claims of all sorts about that since forever. Now compare that, on the other hand, with another case that's suddenly come into the white media news cycle, though I'm sure it's not for the sake of trying to drown out or overshadow the reparations movement going on in Tulsa. The issue in this case revolves around Native American boarding schools. The U.S. government had established them in the early 19th century, like at least 1801, and went on to fund them all the way up until 1969. Now, the current Secretary of the Interior, as you know, is a woman named Deb Haaland. She's the first Native American to hold a cabinet post, and look what she's doing with her position. She's trying to get her people some money. She's using her office in order to press her people's interests. But, to be bluntly honest, as we all know, with all the $5 Indians out there, this is a state-sanctioned action, because a lot of white people are going to stand to get paid when this inevitably turns into a reparations claim. They're trying to use the same language that we use. They're trying to basically have what they say rhyme with what we've been saying. Haaland's office has been compiling a report about the abuses that allegedly took place at these government-sponsored Native American boarding schools. The principal grievance happens to be the fact that a number of those children died while attending these boarding schools. Another point that Secretary of the Interior Haaland made was that these schools were used to erase the language, the religion, and the culture of these Native American communities. And you notice they didn't give her some runaround when it came to compiling the information. Her office has been busy working to put all this together. No years and years talking in circles about how they can't even begin researching what happened. Now, you got sites all over the United States that were the scenes of massacres of black people. And the information has already been compiled in books and already well known, and yet for some strange reason, nothing happens on that. I guess we should ask Sheila Jackson Lee whether or not we need a commission for that too. Now, according to the Reuters story, Congress had approved $7 million to keep the research going. That's what Congress has already done. See, unlike H.R. 40, which hasn't gone anywhere in 30 plus years and was never meant to go anywhere, Congress, and we all know this includes the congressional black talkers like Sheila Jackson Lee, they ponied up the money immediately for this Native American boarding school research. Oh no, that didn't get stuck in committee at all. No 30 years of talking round and round in circles, they just ponied up the money. Here it is. At least $7 million for it. And notice how different the white media's coverage predictably is. Don't hear anything about, well, that happened a long time ago, and, well, this is controversial, and no wringing hands about how, well, wouldn't this be divisive, or do they really have a claim? What kind of law would they base a claim on? They don't do any of that. Not with this, they don't. Now, on the other hand, the white media coverage is totally different for the Tulsa Race Massacre victims. The white media does their usual trying to convince the reader why this is too old to deserve litigation. They even put in the middle of this so-called article, which actually reads more like a hit piece, some nonsense that's trying to discredit the basis for the lawsuit, something that they don't do with that Native American boarding school story. They slip in that Oklahoma sued Johnson & Johnson over opioids, using the same law as the Tulsa Massacre survivors are using, and the suit was initially successful, but it was later overturned on appeal. By the way, the basis for the overturned verdict was that Johnson & Johnson had no control over what people do with their drugs once they leave the manufacturer's factory. So in other words, they're saying, well, it wasn't us that did this. We were just the guys who made the drugs. Somebody else misused it. That's not our fault. Well, I think we can all agree that the white mob who murdered and destroyed an entire black town, and the white insurance companies who refused to compensate the survivors, and the white city officials who took part in supporting the massacre, and making sure that the victims were never compensated, that they never got their lands back, I don't think any of them can say that they weren't involved in that. But this is what the white media is trying to do. They try to mix apples and oranges so that they can manufacture the talking point. The important thing, the point that they had to reach is, somebody else tried to file a lawsuit on this basis and it was overturned. So see, you should look at this the exact same way, even though the two bear no resemblance. Oklahoma's suit against Johnson & Johnson bears no resemblance to the Tulsa Race Massacre victims' lawsuit against the state. But this is what the white media does. They have to make sure that if they're mentioning anything that benefits black people, well, they got to give plenty of reasons why it's a bad thing, or why it's not feasible, or why it's controversial. The white media acts as the PR team for all the anti-black entities that we're at war with, because the white media is one of those anti-black entities. This is about money, but more than that, it's about justice. Something this country has never had for a single moment of its existence, and something that it fights against every minute of every day. It doesn't matter if this happened 500 years ago, or if every black victim of every black massacre in this country died out 1,000 years ago. The damage this country did and continues to do is part of the crime. This government and a lot of its citizens are part of the beneficiaries of the crime. These were not isolated incidents. This was and is state policy specifically against us. Well, we're not going to let the bad guys change the subject, or try to throw up any red herrings, or make any sort of false comparisons to us. They're not trying to discredit or poke holes in the case of, or otherwise try to downgrade or throw any shade at the Native American boarding school story for the same reason they didn't do it with Japanese who were in internment camps or anything else. As long as you're not talking about black people, you're not threatening white supremacy. That's just the cold, hard reality. And here's another one. To face justice, our justice, for their crimes against us, that's the white supremacist's worst nightmare. And it is our duty, our holy mission, to make sure that that nightmare comes true. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Sidney Dawson, Mark Anderson, Eddie Newsom, Sonia Willisey, and Kevin Bryant. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.